Hello, Twiggies. I know it has been a long time since you've heard me give an interview, but I saw a tweet a couple weeks ago so juicy that I absolutely had to reach out and get someone onto the show because I absolutely have wanted to talk to them for years and years. And thanks to Deconstructor of Fun, I have an excuse to. Today, my guest is Daniel Cook, Chief Creative Officer at Spry Fox, longtime game design guru, longtime indie darling, someone whose writing, whose talks, whose games I have admired for a very long time. And Dan, when I saw you tweet that you'd been doing this, was it that it was both your birthday and your 30th year in game development?
Yeah, double whammy right there.
When I saw that, I said, I absolutely have to interview Dan. Actually, my brain went, I absolutely have to get mentored by Dan. How can I do that? How can I trick him into doing that? And this interview is the excuse. So Dan Dank Cook, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. It's I haven't done an interview in a while, so this is fun.
I loved delving back into your blog and thinking that I feel like it was a kinder, gentler version of the internet when you picked Dank as your nickname before it was all about dank memes.
Right. Well, Dank was it was actually a roguelike that I was playing back as a teenager, and I misspelled my name as I was typing it, and it became Dank. And it's stuck with me ever since. And then I used to do art. So I used to do painting and things like that, and eventually pixel art. And so I would sign all my things Dank because, the demo scene, you always had a handle, you had a nickname. And so for probably the first, 15 years on the internet, people only knew me as Dank. They had no idea who I was. And Lost Garden, my website was anonymous. Everything was just like, hey, here's this random person on the internet who's mostly anonymous, and they make art and writing and games. And I was very happy doing that.
I'm trying to think. I know the era of when I first became aware of you as kind of a game design thinker. It was probably about 20 years ago. I was working at Play First, where I think you do the Project Horseshoe with Kenny Dinkin.
Yeah.
Every now and then. So I worked for Kenny, and I remember I paid a lot of attention to Flash, and somewhere I feel like either Bunny went viral in like the J is Games Flash free game of the day kind of universe. There was either or that, or I feel like there was a Lost Garden cute pixel art pack that like went free, and that what was the first thing you remember kind of going viral in terms of in our insular game design internet bubble?
So I remember writing an article on the Wii and Penny Arcade picking that up. And that
I used to read Penny Arcade every day.
And that was probably the first thing that really sort of broke out. And then the Flash games were really just a fun little hobby. And they started getting millions of plays as they did back then, and that kind of took off. And then there was another group, because it was sort of the start of the indie movement, that was just desperately looking for free art. And I was like, look, I've got all this art, because I had been doing pixel art and other art for years at that point, and I had already gone through sort of the death of shareware. And I thought, oh, pixel art is never going to come back. What do I do with all this garbage that I've collected? Hundreds
all these cute bears,
hundreds and hundreds of things. And so I'm like, I'll just put it up for free on the internet. And then people found it, and then they started spreading it from there.
Yeah, it's so fun. It's funny to think about kind of that era before there was a platform for every community and like a way to become a micro influencer over anything, when like things that are totally normal hobbies or side hustles now were just like weird people sitting in front of a computer. Like I remember spending just months like doing weird filter versions of different of different photos from my digital camera. Just like I was oddly compelled to like make this what would now be like, I was just putting Instagram filters on all my art, but it used to just be me in a room doing it for absolutely nobody.
Yep,
And it sounds
and
like
now it's mainstream. Yeah,
yeah.
growing up, we had an Amiga, and so we were heavily influenced by Bitmap Brothers and the whole sort of like UK wave of game development. But we were in the middle of nowhere, Maine. Like for like 100 miles around us, there was nobody who even understood what a computer was for the most
Hmm.
part. And so I was looking at these the Psygnosis artwork and all these amazing creative things that people were doing, and it was like, wow, like what if I just noodle in Deluxe Paint and make this myself? Why? Because I enjoy doing it. Was there any
Yeah.
audience? There was no one you need to even talk to about that sort of thing. So yeah, and the fact that it's now a mainstream thing is kind of still does not 100% compute in my head. In my
Right.
head, I'm still, you know, random kid sitting in a hot room on a summer day making pixel art and making things for his own enjoyment.
Yeah, that's I have that same feeling. So I've touched on a couple things, but why don't you give us a proper introduction? As I said at the top, 30 years in game development. Give us a quick tour of where you've been and what you've worked on in that time.
Sure. So, uh, there's no one career in game development. You kind of have a series of accidents that you sort of bundle together, and in retrospect, you call a career. So, th take this all with a grain of salt. This is all like a series of life events.
Right. It
Um,
seems logical now,
it
but
seems logical now, but that's like I always tell folks that there's no real career progression in game development. You sort of
right.
stumble from project to project, and if you're lucky, you get a chance to keep making games as you get older. So it started out doing the demo scene, pixel art, making things called music discs, where it's like, whoa, wouldn't it be cool if we put music and art and animation and code together in the same space? So that was
Right.
the wild idea. Um, that eventually led to a job, sort of a summer job at what was Epic Mega Games at the time. They had a game called Tyrion, which was a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up. I'd never worked on a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up before, but I'm like, spaceships, I can draw spaceships. So we drew a whole bunch of spaceships and we released that. Eventually, we open sourced Tyrion, and it's still out there to this day on pretty much any platform you can imagine. Um, then around 2000, I was starting to get out of games. I kind of had a big, ugly project that I was working on, and it failed miserably. And I kind of went into like, maybe I'll just make software instead. But I could not get games out of my head. So I started a website called Lost Garden, lostgarden.com, and started just writing about game design. And I was doing board games on the side, and I was designing games, and I was trying to put together weird little side projects. And it was really a space for me just to think about game design and sort of get my own thoughts in order. And again, that was totally anonymous, so I didn't expect anyone to read it. It was more like blogs of that era. There was no concept of influencers.
Right.
It was more like there's a person on the internet writing about something they care about. Some people were writing about quilting and buttons, and I was writing about games. Uh, and then I ended up getting my MBA around that time because I was really sort of pissed off, to be quite honest, that I had all these ideas and no one would listen to me. They were always like going on about money and economics and like feasibility and production schedule and all these things that at the time, as a younger, in my 20s guy, I was like, this is dumb. Why don't we just make cool shit?
Right.
And so I was like, let's get the language and the tools to be able to talk to folks. And that was incredibly useful. And now I can at least speak business with people. I don't know if I'm good at it, but it gives a framing for the creative ideas that's super useful. Um, Wandered through Microsoft, where I met my co-founder, David Edery. Then we started up Spry Fox, sort of capitalizing on the Flash games that I was working on at the time. And then that led to a whole bunch of games on a whole bunch of different platforms over like 14 years. And then Spry Fox is still going. Last year we were acquired by Netflix. So now we're in a new adventure there.
I, listening to that, you and I seem to have had a very similar inflection moment in our histories, and I love that your response was that you got an MBA so that you could power through those discussions, but then went back to being this indie kind of punk rock spirit, do-it-yourself person, whereas I gave myself an MBA, but went deep into I am the money guy, right?
Right.
But it was motivated very much by the same kind of moment, which is, and I think we'll talk about this a lot, as a game designer, how do I communicate my ideas in a way that you will get excited on them and we can start building them together, right? Like, how do I turn my thing it makes so much sense into my head into something that makes so much sense that we can work on it together?
Yeah. I think of it as leading from the side. Like in a lot of particularly design positions, you don't actually have official power. But somehow you have to inspire and motivate people and understand their needs and how the design can serve their needs. And that's engineers, artists, marketing, money. Like there's all sorts of people who need to have their needs satisfied. Obviously, the players as well. And so, to me, part of leading from the side is learning to speak their language, learning to understand what they need, and sort of building a sort of common vision that they can all buy into. That they're like, oh yeah, this has what I want within it. And the MBA was like one of the steps along the way
Mm-hmm.
to get that.
Yeah, it gave you the language and the tools to help kind of have empathy with somebody who probably had a very hard time having empathy with you and what your wants and needs were as a creative person.
Yeah. There's a nonviolent communication idea, which is that when somebody is angry or antagonistic, all they're doing is they're desperately trying to communicate with whatever tools that they have. And they may be poor tools, they may be like not the best tools, but they're just trying to communicate and get their needs met. And as long as you accept that, then it doesn't have to be a conflict. It can actually be oh, I see where you're coming from. Let's talk about that. And then
Yeah.
people suddenly they just loosen right up.
So one thing that unites both of us is we do a lot of writing on game design. We do a lot of speaking on game design. We both, I would say, have a hobby of being pro bono game design professors that nobody asked for. Would you?
Yeah, very true.
I added to that pro bono journalist within a micro industry for some reason. But when the types of topics you write about are very different than mine, and I find your work, your writing very inspiring, right? Some of the like if someone goes to Lost Garden right now, they'll find kind games designing for pro-social multiplayer, social design practices for human scale online games, like a lot of your work, and it makes sense even if you just look at a screenshot of Cozy Grove or Bushido Bear or Alpha Bear, like there's kind of a kind-heartedness to your work, and it's not just in the games you build on teams with Spry Fox, but then also I see it in your writing and what interests you and what you like to think about. But something that I wanted to ask is why, what do you get out of writing and speaking and content creation? Like, what is it that, where do you find fulfillment, or what's your why for making this content, for being this, pro bono professor out there?
So a lot of times these are hard, complicated problems, and some people think by talking. I don't think by talking. I'm very much an introvert, and so I think by writing. And so a lot of it is just writing this stuff out, organizing my thoughts, putting them together in a form that is coherent. Is something I do for myself, And then if other folks benefit, that's great as well. What I found is that a lot of these topics, people don't get it the first time they read through. Where I found some of these ideas really click is people read it the first time, it kind of sits in the back of their head, and then they go through some experience where they can put it into use, and then they start to understand through practice. I'm a big believer that theory is great, but ultimately you need to put theory into practice in order for you to get a sort of almost a mouth feel for it. You know, you have to have a taste for like what does it mean to do this craft. Um, and so I do it mostly for myself, and then there's a long-term impact I've seen that makes me quite happy. But it's really over like 5, 6 years where this stuff starts to seep into people's brains, and then they
Yeah.
start operating on it.
That's so funny because I feel very similarly. Like any talk I give, it's not so I can teach the audience, it's actually so that I can teach myself. It's me like signing up for a due date for a paper that I want to write so that I can myself work through a problem. That's very much all of the writing I've done or talks is inherently selfish in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it
Uh,
feels good. I mean, I think I don't know about you, but like to me it feels good to like add to the conversation, to like help
mhm.
people out. Like I am always desperately wanting to help people out. Like that's just something that I'm not very good at, and I feel like I need to try harder because that's like there's an immense amount of joy in helping other people. So that's, I
Yeah,
think, part
absolutely.
of it.
Um, and then something funny that literally happened to this week when you talk about that long tail. Probably the piece of content that I've done that people have brought up the most is this idea called the Tower of Want that I came up with to help with building free to play game economies and like scaffolding scaffolding activity loops, like going beyond a core loop concept that I thought
Hmm.
had gotten very stale. And somebody emailed me about it 2 weeks ago and was like, "Hey man, like just want to say thanks for this thing." And I was having trouble with a game design problem in the game I'm working on right now. And I was like, "Oh right, I built a tool to help me with this exact problem 10 years ago." And I watched myself, a younger, thinner, with more hair version of myself, give a lecture. I'm like, you were kind of smart past Ethan, and then it actually helped me power through the problem I was working on.
Yeah, it's that happens all the time. I did a thing on uh, basically loops and how you scaffold them together to create like uh, skill trees and like, so you know, like, oh, I need to jump on an enemy. Oh, how do I kill an enemy? Well, I jump on them, but I first need to learn how to jump. So you got to teach jumping before you can learn how to kill the enemy by jumping on them. And so those sort of dependency chains with skill learning is something I wrote about ages and ages ago, and it comes up in almost every single design. And I forget about it like every other design that I work on. I'm like, oh yeah, wait, oh, that's that problem again. Yep.
That's funny. Well, already I feel much less alone just from talking to you.
We're all
Uh,
stumbling through the same thing together.
yeah.
That's a real truth of all this.
So the instigation for this, for wanting to talk to you, as I said, was 30 years in game development is that's an accomplishment. Not a lot of people, this is a very difficult industry. Um, it's very hard for people to stay in it that long because it grinds a lot of people down. I mean, I think with the thousands and thousands of people who've been laid off recently, a lot of them are never going to take another game development job. That's just kind of the nuts and bolts of it. So with this long in the field and this long having an being successful, having as a group, Spry Fox has a defined voice. I think from the outset, right? I don't want to try and represent it like it's all you. It's a team effort, and it's a team that it's like as a band, there's a defined sound to the band. And I've seen it, mature over time and move into interesting genres and move in interesting ways. What do you think as you reflect on that 30-year milestone, what are some of the hallmarks of how you've matured as a game designer over that time? What are some of the things that you've learned or the ways you work that have changed?
So when I started out, there wasn't really such a thing as game design. There were a handful of groups that were practicing it, folks at LucasArts or Infocom who are practicing it. But the idea like, oh, game design, what is that even, wasn't really an idea. And there definitely weren't like schools or textbooks or things like that. More manifestos, if anything. Uh, and so I approached it as this is a completely unknown space. Let's do wild ideas. Let's take ideas from science fiction books. Let's imagine that anything is possible and try to make video games out of it. And you still see that sort of attitude exist. When I think of what Tim Sweeney's doing with Epic and Unreal, he comes from that era and that generation. And so, like, he now has billions of dollars, but he can imagine, like, what if I do this wild and crazy thing? Because that's the era that generation of game developer came from. And it's very exciting. But it also results in a lot of thrash and missed schedules and experiments that are honestly just bad experiments. Like I was doing all sorts of bad experiments that were dumb game design. And over the years, I've started to figure out like, oh, here's a more reliable tool set. Here's things that I can take risks on. Here are things that I can like not take risks on. Like I don't need to take a risk on this particular save function, or not everything needs to be 100% new. Um, the other part of that, so you've got your tools that I've slowly been building, and I think that's a lifelong pursuit. I think in this rapidly changing industry, you're always trying to figure out what your tools are. The other piece is a team. Like you said, this is a team sport. It's a band that you're trying to hold together for a long period of time. You need to communicate really, really tightly with one another. We use the metaphor of a jazz band a lot. It's like you need to be like you just need to like tilt your head a little bit, and the other person needs to recognize that's when we're doing this particular part of the song. And everyone, that's when this person gets to improv. And you need that really, really tight, just high collaboration, high mastery communication and performance. And that comes honestly not from throwing a bunch of random people together, but by having a team that works together and has had long conversations and lots of failures and lots of successes together.
Yeah, that what's funny or what's interesting to me about that is with what I'm doing now currently, right? I'm like 9 months into a startup where I'm working with the CTO who I'd never worked with before. But when we talked for the first time, it was clear, to use your jazz band metaphor, it was clear that we'd worked for the same band leader before. Right. Or a very similar band leader, right? Like I had done a lot of mobile free-to-play and spent a long time working from people who'd worked at Zynga on mobile free-to-play. And he spent a long time in mobile free-to-play at Zynga. And so it in our earliest conversations, it felt like we spoke the same language. And then when we got to our first like design task together, I made a spreadsheet. I was like, this is kind of how I see the config design for this set of features. He's like, got it. And then went off, built it, came back, and it was clear that we were speaking the same language, or that we were able to skip a couple years into that relationship because we'd had enough shared experiences before. Mm-hmm. But there nothing can beat. I think you said 14 years with Spry Fox, right? Like nothing can beat working with a band, and I'm sure players have changed and you've got a different oboist now or whatever. I'm going to kill this. I'm really going to torture this jazz band metaphor. Yeah. But that experience of working together, knowing, speaking a very similar language and having similar experiences over years and years.
Yeah, it absolutely helps. And I'm fascinated to see that a lot of the long-term surviving studios, I mean, some of it is they're survivors because they had wild successes. But some of them end up doing their best work in later years because they have the resources, they have the team, they have the tool set, they have the build pipeline, like all these little tiny things that you don't really think about, but are really important when you're trying to iterate quickly and rapidly on a cool big idea. And so I feel like there's almost a trend, and Nintendo is probably the biggest example of this, towards like veteran teams having an advantage in this space that is probably underestimated.
Mhm. And to go back to your points, the advantage comes from I love the insight of just the big change, knowing where to take your creative risks, right? Like
Yes.
knowing the things that aren't impactful versus the things that are. That I 100% agree with.
That's such a
Is
hard lesson. We struggled with that. Like I think of all the drama that we've had at Spry Fox, and a large percentage of it is sometimes I'm just like a little YOLO, and I'm like, woohoo, let's go in this direction. And it's like that was a dumb idea. And what we really needed to do is sort of like say, well, we have this idea of weight bearing. Like here's the experience we're trying to drive, and here's the elements that sort of like bear the weight of that experience. And you can do something random, but it's not going to get you towards the experience you want. And on the other hand, if you remove something that is weight bearing, like we're just going to throw away combat. Well, what was that doing in this game? And you need to replace it with something else. So being a lot more thoughtful about like what elements you're doing, how they contribute to the final experience, the cost of those elements, what's the small scaffolding that you can get in place to drive that experience sooner rather than later. Like all those things are sort of the order of operations of game development, which is not just throwing stuff at the wall. Throwing stuff at the wall results not in a building that stands up; it's just a pile of crap. So that was a big lesson.
That's a great way to think about it. And on that combat example, right? I remember in researching for this interview, one of the things I read was about how a lot of the Spry Fox games shy away from or remove combat, and that that probably makes your life a lot harder in terms of combat is holds a lot of weight in a building that is a game because I think I either heard this in Cliffy B's book or maybe when I talked to him, he's like, it's very simple. I shoot something, it dies. It's a very easy metaphor or interaction to understand. I shoot it or I punch it, it gets hurt, it dies, right? And so not only is it easy to understand, especially if you've got gun, like it's much harder even if you punch things. If you're standing away, just in terms of technology, it's easy to throw a ball at something and then they get hurt and die, right? It simplifies a lot of our problems. So what are when you've removed from kind of known game patterns the weight bearing pillar of game design of combat, what are some of the design methods or tools you have to figure out, well, how do I replace that? What does that need to replace in this game system, and what are some of the ways you've solved that over time?
So it really depends on the game. I mean, I've built combat games as well.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the so the biggest shift there is you realize that you're not a completely flexible creator. You realize like, oh wait, I'm trained in making combat games. And so I have this skill set, a set of like rote patterns, a set of fallbacks. Like the player has some issue, and it's like, oh, I know the fallback there because I've studied lots of combat games, and I know exactly what to do in this situation. And so the biggest thing that happens is you have to realize, oh, you're not a good game designer. You're a good game designer of combat games. And
Hmm.
so when you take away combat, you're not just invalidating a whole bunch of mechanics, you're invalidating a whole bunch of creative patterns that you've built up as a designer. And so then you need to build a whole new set of creative patterns and fallbacks and design tactics. And so if you look outside of combat games, there's actually an enormous number of interesting games out there. So we made a word game called Alpha Bear. There's
Hmm.
no combat in Alpha Bear. Your goal is to make a big bear by spelling words. There's actually a whole bunch of really, really interesting word games out there. But if you haven't trained on that, and if you don't have that skill set, you won't know where to go with the design when bad things start showing up. And so that's sort of lesson number one is like find out what the activity is that's not combat, and then train yourself on those design tools. Um, and it's it's actually not hard once you make that switch because it turns out that board games are mostly nonviolent, casual games are mostly nonviolent, sports are mostly nonviolent. Basically, almost every other flavor of play and human hobby is not shooting people in the head. So it's really only this weird myopia that video game designers have that say there's only video games about shooting people in combat because that's all there is. And it's like, well, that's actually not true. You just need to break out of that space and look elsewhere, and suddenly the world opens up. And then you need to practice at it because it's still not easy if you don't have the skills.
So speaking to the world outside of combat games, the Deconstructor of Fun audience, a lot of us are mobile game developers, and merge games have been one of the biggest genres of the past couple years. One of the things that created a lot of new hit games. And as far as I can tell, Tripletown, the Spry Fox game, was the progenitor of that genre, right? My 8-year-old, actually no, my 3-year-old has been playing My Little Pony main merge on the iPad recently and absolutely loving it. And part of me's like, seeing that this week, I was like, oh, like that game traces directly back to Tripletown, and Tripletown was such a fun and sticky and innovative game design at that time, and is now turned into like this free to play juggernaut, which is real that not that specific game, unfortunately, but that genre. So what do you remember about kind of the origins of Tripletown? How the Spry Fox team came to that design?
So yeah, that one was like one of our first games, and so it was a early prototype that I had been working on. It was started out as kind of a weird experimental Civ game that was minimalist. How do we do a Civ game on a touch screen? And I had this idea of like tapping things, and maybe they like have some sort of like poker rules to them where they like connect up or transform. And the one that worked the best out of all those was just a simple one, which is put three things next to each other and they turn into one thing. That's the next level up. And then from there, we're like, okay, that's a little boring on its own. Maybe we'll add additional mechanics on top of that. And so that's the origin of it. These were minimalist games. I was in a period of my life where I'm like, elegance is really important, minimalism is really important. Um, this is also the era of like nobody knew how to use touch screens at the time, so
Mm-hmm.
everyone was desperately trying to figure out how do you use a touch screen. And so you had Fruit Ninja, which is like, what if you swipe? You had Jetpack Joyride. What if you could tap and hold? Like, what does that do? And this was a like, is there any sort of like interesting building or crafting if you just tap on the screen and put a piece down on a simple grid? And so that was kind of the problems people were trying to solve at that time, and so that I was part of that sort of movement. Um, Minimalist games are you try like 1,000 different variations, and some of them click, and then you tune in on the fun. They're very fragile, but it turned out that the merge mechanic was not fragile at all. It was actually wildly robust. And once you find a wildly robust mechanic, that's where genres come from. They're like, oh, let's just keep using this again and again and again.
As a team, when you're going through it, so I have mainly worked in startup environments, right? And where you don't, just the luxury of trying 1,000 things. I can't think of ever having been on a project like that, right? Like I feel like I'm always on projects that are like, have the idea, run, get it out there,
Right.
So on one hand, it sounds to me incredibly freeing, but on the other hand, that decision that the mechanic is robust and the right one, that's subjective. That's not
highly subjective. Yeah.
So how was there a moment where as a team you figured out that like, oh, this is the magical thing? Like how when you're sifting through all those different ideas, do you lock in and say, this is the one we're committing to?
So usually I like to work with basically one programmer. I'm not a programmer myself, and so my job is the suggest what we do next and help converge the design on something. So we're not randomly searching the space. So a good example of more randomly searching the space is I don't know if you've ever seen the Threes design doc. They released.
I've never read it. No.
They basically released like, here are all of our chat messages about what we went through over a very long period of time to iterate towards threes. And it's a wonderful document. It is absolutely not how I design at all. It is like, as opposed to trying something and seeing how it works out, I try to have a theory of how something will work out, and I try to look for things in the existing prototype that I can amplify. I'm looking, like, you always hear about design by subtraction. I often look at design by amplification, which is like, yes, we want to remove some things, but is there something that I can amplify, make better, make clearer, make that cause and effect interaction clearer and more obvious? And so we're always making sort of a step forward with the design, and some of them don't work, but a lot of them do, because you're doing it in this very intentional fashion. And part of it is you start playing the game and you start you try to look beyond the surface of the game. Like if you just did a normal playtest and you just gave one of these prototypes to somebody, there would be, this is a garbage game. It's not fun. The pacing's all wrong, so on and so forth. And as I play it, I try to look at like, could the pacing be fun? What would that look like? Is there any sort of interesting like expressive space in this particular mechanic? What would that be? What would be a good example of that? And then you do the next iteration of the game towards that. And it helps these experimental games converge a lot faster. And the fact that you're only doing it with one programmer, I mean, back in the day, I used to have like 5 or 6 projects going at once where I was playing that designer role, and then we would have, multiple programmers working on a thing. And some of those work out and some of those don't work out. But it's a way of reducing the cost of iterating on innovative things.
That's a mind-blowing, the golden insight from this talk for me, the amplification mindset, because as you were saying it, I had the strongest sense memory of the original demo of one of the early games that I built the prototype, and the prototype was hugely successful internally, and we could not figure out how to turn it into a game. Like, we did eventually make a full game. It like probably moderately made its money back, but I know that me, the designer, then could not have heard that advice and just had the series of thoughts I just had. But I'm like, oh, I just figured out how to design the game I should have designed literally 20 years ago, because there was one moment of the prototype that worked. And if I looked at that and thought, how do I amplify that moment without innovating in the wrong direction? Damn it, Dan, you just solved the mystery of Shark Island. Fuck.
there you go. And like I do find that you become better at this over time. Um, th this this sort of surgical design, like my team is probably tired of hearing me use the word surgical because like
Hmm.
sometimes people want to do dramatic pivots, and
Hmm.
usually that's the absolute last thing a project needs. What a
Mm.
project needs is it needs to know what it wants to be, and then what's the smallest change that you can make to get to move it towards that. And if you're doing like we are very very indie in our mindset, like we small teams, small changes. Cost is always an issue. Like there's in some AAA teams, there's always this idea of like there's design who are these wild and creative, crazy people, and then there's production who basically tells designers no all the time, right? And that's the AAA mindset. You have to set up this antagonistic relationship between cost and design. From an indie perspective, like cost and design are the same space, they're the same problem, same set of constraints. So I'm always looking like, how do we have the biggest bang for our buck? And every single design decision is basically uh, taking that into account. It's like we've got a small prototype. We only have two people on it. What's the smallest thing I can do to move this towards what it wants to be? And so you're doing this amplification, but you're doing it in very tactical, surgical ways.
Yeah, there's a phrase in filmmaking that's like put all the money on the screen, and
Uh-huh.
that surgical, and what that means is basically all the money that you spend better translate into people see, and that sort of surgical philosophy is a game development version of that, right?
Yeah.
Like as you said, a wild pivot where you throw everything out but the high concept and start fresh. You just took all the money and threw it in the trash.
Yeah.
You're not putting it on the screen where the player can see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, some of these games don't converge. They don't turn into something. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing to amplify. And then the hard part is knowing when to cut your losses. And I'm very bad at that. But
Okay, so that gives me a perfect segue into when I was researching for this. I read your essay, "What is a Daniel Cook game?" And you mentioned that Spry Fox, as a team, you had a successful Flash game, Steambirds, and then you spent 7 years on the uh, version 2 of it, Steambirds Alliance. And just how did you end up in that trap of spending 7 years on one idea, and what was it that drove the team to keep investing in that game?
so we had a theory, a market theory, which was we had Realm of the Mad God, which was a successful MMO. And it had interesting monetization, and it had interesting retention, and it had very interesting reach. And we're like, oh, that's great. And I was also super intrigued by, and I still am to this day, multiplayer design. And so that was like, wow, this is an amazing space to be in as a team. Like very few people are doing multiplayer design, multiplayer games. We have a success in that space that maybe we can replicate that. We also had an IP, which was Steambirds, which was a turn-based strategy game. So totally different than Realm of the Mad God. And we thought, oh, let's take the successful IP, marry it with this successful genre, and build a MMO airplane fighting game. Um, and So we're like, oh, we've got that idea. How hard can this be? Turns out that it was very, very hard. We built the game, um, and we basically ignored the signs that it was a bad idea. We kept getting like just little comments from people that that they didn't quite get it, or they weren't as excited about it as we were. We'd almost done the intellectual exercise of
I'm
justifying
picturing
it.
like I'm picturing you like looking at journal January 5th. Wife says this game is not fun. You should stop. March 8th. Wife, this game I don't get it. Why are you still working on
We
it?
had so many advisors telling us to just kill it, or asking us why were we continuing. And there's kind of a sunk cost fallacy that shows up at that point. We had, we had money from Tripletown still around, and so there wasn't the existential threat saying stop, this isn't working. And so we thought if we just push through and ship it, we'll get a lot of players and we'll start having money come in. It will be self-supporting and all that. Um, there was a cost to the team. The team really suffered because there was this ongoing, never-ending project that who's, you know, kept not meeting its goals. I mean, we burnt through a ton of money, very much so. Um, yeah, um, yeah. Anyway, no one wants to be a bird in an airplane. Turns out it's a very niche dream.
It almost makes me think that the first game was more of a meme game, like Steambirds. You misinterpreted this is a funny pun and wordplay, and it goes viral for its meme ability to an actual player fantasy.
So I think we killed the player fantasy. So the player fantasy of the first one was very much World War II with a little bit of steampunk, airplane tactics. So it was a war game. It had like the map view. You were maneuvering airplanes on a map, which is a relatively uncommon thing. And it felt very much like strategy, tactics, wargamer, people who like World War II but don't mind a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of steampunk in there. And it kind of had the cool Danny B war music soundtrack that was pumping, and it was like it had a player fantasy. And as we merged that with a team that really likes cute things and really likes, like nonviolence and is not really into war, there was a mismatch between like what the players wanted and what we as a team were excited about. And I think that showed up in strange ways within the game. Um, yeah.
If you could go back in time and give that younger version of yourself day one of Steambird's Alliance, what are some of the what advice would you give that younger version of you?
So there's uh, in AAA they talk a lot about player fantasy, and I don't think back then we had a really robust sort of language or workshopping of like what is the key player fantasy. And I would have spent a lot more time focused on that, and say, I know you've been thinking about this, but really think about it. And is that actually a thing? And can you name any single individual who wants that? Um, the other one is understanding retention. Um, at that point, so when Triple Time came out, for example, it had amazing retention. We had no idea that was a superpower because at that time, free to play really didn't have a strong language around like what were key
Right.
metrics. The people were just figuring out the idea that retention was a thing. They were just figuring out that you know, uh, oh, maybe it's 1 day retention that matters. No, like 30-day retention. Why would you even talk about that with a flash game? It was a different universe in terms of like
Yeah.
understanding of what drove a successful games as a service. Um, and so we were still coming off of some of that old, like, oh, we don't really value retention. We kind of do, but we're not really focused on it. And what ultimately killed that game is we made the realization, perhaps belatedly, that retention was important, and that game did not retain well at all. And the source of free users that had resulted in the explosion of Realm of the Mad God from the Flash era was gone. Like we were in
Right.
the land of advertising at that point. And so the ability to like just dump millions and millions of users onto your players onto your game, and a small fraction of them stick around, was just not viable any longer. And so the market dynamics had shifted radically. Our understanding of what success meant had shifted radically, and so I would have I would have loved to save 7 years of learning by just putting those few things in a bullet point and shipping them
Yeah.
backwards in time.
In that same essay, when you talk about your most recent Spry Fox period, you wrote, the pain of the previous 7 years convinced me I needed a new set of production and risk management tools. And we'd bounced around from genre to genre excessively and weren't able to build team momentum. So my next set of designs tried to lean into all these factors. When you think about that, how far do you feel that when you hear that, how far do you feel Cozy Grove has taken you on this journey?
Cozy Grove has been a relevation, actually. It's so we knew the team liked making cozy games. We knew the vibe. Like we have a very high trust, awesome set of people here who aren't really into. I mean, some of them like action games and violent games. That's definitely it's a mix. But a lot of people, they don't. And a lot of what attracted them to work at Spry Fox were games like Alpha Bear and Triple Town. So knowing who you are as a studio is really, really important. And we realized, oh wait, we're not the team that can make anything. We actually do have a groove. And so we had been trying to make a Animal Crossing game for ages, and I just hadn't quite clicked in on the design. So I finally understood the design well enough to sort of make a pitch around it. Um, and once we started doing life sims and cozy games, just everything became easier. The art became easier, the game design became easier, the business model became easier. And it was like, oh, like let's like we're in a space where we can actually uh, build up knowledge that's in sync with what the team wants to do, and we can get better at this. And I look forward and I'm like, oh, well, we can actually get better at this over many, many years. Like, this is a space where I'm excited to sort of invest in it and become world class at it over, I don't know how many years will go, but I think we'll go quite a few more. Um,
So at the top, we talked a little bit about, we hit on this topic of intrinsic motivation, right? You
yes.
would sit and make pixel art. I would put early Photoshop filters on photos. We write, like, there are things inside of us as creators that want to come out for mysterious reasons that my psychologist has yet to exhume. But it sounds like with Cozy Grove, as a team, you had an intrinsic motivation as creators to make this style of game. And that has made everything about making that game easier. As someone who doesn't play a lot of cozy games, what do you think are what are the intrinsic motivations for players that what do they get out of cozy games? What are their motivations?
So we wrote a paper on this actually back in the day, and we can link to it someplace. But so if you think of like sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people are like hunger, survival, all these sort of stressors where if you don't have them, you will die. Like if you don't have sleep, if you don't have food, if you don't have drink, and that's where games have mostly focused. They're kind of in this like survival-based motivations.
Right.
They simulate them. And cozy games tend to sort of be like up a little bit. They're more about like relationship building and friendship and reflecting upon yourself and self-improvement and mastery. And in order to have a space where you can do those sort of higher order operations, you need to like remove a lot of those survival things. Make a space where those survival elements are taken care of so that you actually have time to like build a long-term friendship with somebody or, like have a moment of calm to yourself outside your hectic, hyper-capitalist American day, where you can think about yourself or think about what your feelings are or drink a cup of coffee. And so I think cozy games at their heart, that's what they provide. Um,
That's a really, really insightful. Uh, I it it seems so obvious. I'm sure it took a long time to get to that insight. It's funny. What it makes me think of is I spent a couple years trying to make Web3 games work, and I had a very specific reason why, as someone who'd focused on monetization, I thought we could do game design. I thought we could do game monetization better, less exploitively with Web3. I can put that unwritten essay on the shelf. It doesn't matter. But when I when I quit the Web3 space, one of the realizations I had was the number one stress of my life is finances, is money and stock values going up and down. And am I going to be able to pay for mortgage? Am I going to be able to send my kids to school and gymnastics camp? And every day it's, that stress is with me all the time. And Web3 games, by layering on a layer of these liquid assets with volatile, real world valuations that change minute by minute, I realized I was just adding extra stock markets to my life.
Yep.
I'm like, I don't want more stock markets. Like when I play Mass Effect, it is not because I want this stress compounded in my life. And so it was getting rid of all of those digital assets reduced a great deal of stress. And I could only see that when I got rid of them. I was like, oh, thank God. So that's why, like, thinking about Animal Crossing and similar games like Cozy Grove, building a space where you can say, well, this isn't 7 Days to Die or The Forest. All those stressful things are gone. Now let's do the things that find fulfillment. Like, it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So, on that topic of authentic and intrinsic motivations, in kind of our pre-interview talk, you said something about that you'd been thinking a lot about games that serve these authentic motivations as opposed to inducing new needs via game systems. And if I think about a lot of my work in free-to-play, it's inducing new needs via game systems. And I thought, like, this is a really super interesting and fertile area to dig into. So just to start with, can you give some examples of what you mean when you say authentic intrinsic motivations?
So, an extrinsic motivator is usually like there is some sort of outside stimuli that is encouraging you to do a particular thing. And an intrinsic one is something that emerges naturally from you as an organism wanting to do a thing. In self-determination theory, there's this intrinsic urge to sort of self-determine how you operate in the world. This comes from positive psychology, and you have things like autonomy, mastery, oh my God, togetherness, basically support by social entities and support of others is part of it. And so these are sort of the broad category of intrinsic motivations, and it's a spectrum. There are things that are very extrinsic. Like the classic example is there's a person making chairs. And because they're making chairs, they're paid $5 an hour to make chairs, and they're extrinsically motivated to make chairs because it's their job. And then as they make chairs, they slowly realize that there's actually some mastery in making chairs. There's like, you can make chairs better or worse. And they realize that there's some autonomy. They have control over like which design of chair they make or how they make a particular chair. Um, and then they realize that there's like support there. There's a social support aspect to it, where there's other people who say, "Wow, you made a really wonderful chair. That's an amazing job. Good, well done." And then at a certain point, you have the master craftsperson who is like, they make chairs and they love doing it because there's actually an entire universe of life and growth within making chairs. And so it's a spectrum. And so when you say, well, is this hard? Is this an extrinsic motivator or is this an intrinsic motivator? Really depends on the person, depends on the system, depends on the social context.
And
There's a whole bunch of stuff that is intrinsic, like generally like our urge to connect with others. can be very, very intrinsic. Like I'm feeling lonely and I wish I want to connect with others and have friends. That can also be extrinsic as well. Like I'm a business person who needs to make 22 contacts so I can convert them into sales in order to make my numbers. Same exact sort of action, but from obviously within a different system, it becomes extrinsic. So these things are somewhat subtle, and they are something that you need to sort of talk to your players and understand. Like, would you do this just because you want to, and why? Do you have any regrets about doing this? Do you feel any stress when you're forced to do this? So it's a little bit of a subtle area. But mastery, autonomy, and togetherness and social support are kind of the key ones.
And what are some well-known games you think are paragons of fulfilling these authentic human motivations?
So what's interesting is almost every game will have a group of players who are intrinsically motivated to play it a particular way. Um, and I look at something like Roblox, where bunch of kids. They're like, I want to play with friends. I want to be able to have something to talk about that's delightful. There's a space where we can hang out without like parents getting all in our grill. Like that is a very pure motivation, I think. Minecraft is probably one of the best examples of this. I like to explore. I like to have a place to play. I'm not allowed to go outside because America is frightened of children playing. So like Minecraft is this very, very pure space where you can like hang out, make stuff, play with the mud, wander around, pretend to kill monsters, and do it with your friends. So those I think are some great ones. Um, Nintendo titles tend to have relatively pure intrinsic motivators. Like, why are you playing Breath of the Wild? Are you really playing because you are like extrinsically motivated to save the princess? Not really. You're kind of like, it's a fun space. You can kind of do what you want. There's lots of, autonomy. There's lots of mastery. There's lots of like exploration. And there are systems that sort of nudge you in a direction, but they're relatively light touch. They're relatively, I think of their, like, is a Nintendo system coercive? And they're not very coercive in general.
Right. With Breath of the Wild, one of the things that was a big friction point for me and why it's still actually after a bunch of hours on my backlog of like get back to and appreciate what a work of art it is. When you wander around that game and like I forget what they're called, like the goblins, like you come up on them and they just seem to be like hanging out, making fish, like have not hurting anybody, and you go and you slaughter them because video game. It was like their character designs got too good. They seem too human. Like it seems like I'm out here as a rampaging monster, just destroying these perfectly peaceful villagers for no reason at all.
Yeah, and this is the other thing about motivations is every person kind of has their own mix of motivations. So really, when we're talking about motivations of a game, we're talking about a population level understanding. And there are subsegments within that population, and like one group may be really motivated by like just messing with like little minions, right? And for that group, those little moblins and stuff are like super exciting because they fulfill. Oh, here's a little creature I can mess with and take their loot. And then for someone who's more on the like caretaking or nurturing, or I see these as people, they're like, I don't want to do that. Like I'm not surprisingly, I'm more of a pacifist player of those games. So I like sneak around the edges. I run away from enemies. I like find all the nooks and crannies I can and grab all the loot because I love doing that. But I never beat the game because like beating a big boss is like not my motivation at all. That's not my motivational profile. So when you're talking about these topics, it's really good to talk to real players and talk to multiple real players and see what excites them. Um, yeah.
And from a game design challenge, this feels to me like a very difficult challenge you and the team have taken on in fulfilling these motivations, because um, the types of games I've worked on, log in for 30 days to get this cool hero,
Sure.
right? Complete all these achievements every day of the event in order to top the leaderboard and in order to get this great gun. Like, these are all really relatively easy things to do,
But
right? Like,
you know this more than probably anybody else. There's a limit to what those can do for you. Like you
mhm,
can change the long-term retention by relatively small amounts, if at all,
right,
when you do those things. Like that level of extrinsic structure, like people are smart. Eventually they figure it out. Um, and if you want to make a game that lasts for a decade, those things don't work. Um, what you've done is instead of like serving a real human need, that instead of you're like actively helping somebody thrive. What you're doing is you're increasing their short-term engagement, and short-term may be 90 days, right? It may be a year for like plus 5% or plus 1%. Um, and like that's not the path to creating a long-term value for a long-term community.
right. Yeah, those are the crutches you use to get them to the elder game, to the guild game, where
Right.
the togetherness of the guild working together. But they, as you said, they can only take you so far. Um, and so part of why, as a fellow game designer, why I'm kind of in awe, or I'm like scared in a way when I read and hear you talk about it. It kind of scares me because I'm like, that seems really hard to fulfill those things, and like you said, making a game that people want to play for 5 years, it's really hard. So what are some of the tricks you've learned, or like what are some of the tools you and the team have learned about how to build game systems that authentic that really harness these authentic emotions?
Um, hmm. So first you have to start with that player promise and player value. That's the number one place you start with. Is like is does this resonate with people, and people get excited about it even without all the gamification and progression systems and all that? Do people want this in their life? Um, that's sort of like the first and foremost thing you have to think about. Um, uh, the other one is I tend to look for like needs in society that are poorly met. So like right now we're working on loneliness, because like loneliness is a huge issue right now. And how do we connect people? A lot of the if you've read things like Bowling Alone, a lot of the social structures, particularly in America, that let people like interact with each other and have a normal human relationship like normal humans have had anytime in the past like 10,000 years, are starting to erode and not be present in people's lives. And so people are kind of growing apart. They're starting to have this sort of hyper individualism, and like then they're sad as a result. So to me, I look at that and I'm like, wow, all the data points in this direction. I bet there's a real human need there that we could serve and actually help people thrive by serving that. So that's another one. Look at the big picture. Like look at society and how do we help people out. I mean, that seems like a big idea for poor little video games, but poor little video games have been doing this for ages. Like poor little video games have been like helping people escape. They've been helping people like form parasocial relationships. They've been helping people like have moments of respite from a difficult time. So video games have been serving real authentic needs. Let's keep doing that. The other one is think long term. Think about communities, as opposed to day one, day seven, day 30. How does your community generate value? The community is they love this thing that you've made. They want to bring more people in because they love it so much. It is an important, critical part of their lives. Like when I hear Destiny 2 players talk about like what Destiny means to them, It is their social space. It is their bar. And they're constantly trying to bring people into Destiny 2 because they want their friends to hang out with the bar at them. So think about community and long-term community as opposed to sort of short-term, like numbers going up, because your numbers won't go up long-term if you don't think about this stuff. And then the other one is sort of countermetrics. How do you know when you're optimizing for the wrong thing? Because we tend to build these optimization machines. One of the things worth looking at is regret. Do people regret playing your game? If you were to talk to them a year after they dropped $30,000 on your game, would they regret it? And if they do, then you've actually probably gone wrong someplace. Because I know people who have dropped $30,000 on Magic the Gathering or $30,000 on a car, and they're totally happy. We just saw someone's train sets, their model train set. They clearly spent way more than $30,000 on that model train set. And I bet it provided them with decades of enjoyment. So ask about regret. Have those countermetrics that allow you to sort of like prevent yourself from over optimizing on non-human values.
And that's great. Do you have any human needs that you have in that process of those thousands of prototypes and experiments and little trial and error? Is there any white whale? Is there any human motivation that you feel like video games haven't been able to crack yet?
I mean, there's the one I'm working on right now, which is loneliness and human connection. I think video games have demonstrated they're very capable of doing that. As I was digging into it, I did a bunch of investigation into sort of three other areas that are adjacent to like human relationships and community. I looked into economics, which is a mostly bullshit pseudoscience from the 1800s, but it has like very popular, but it's a very poor design language. It sees itself as a historical sort of thing that doesn't understand that psychology exists. And so economics was an interesting area that I think design could bring a lot to. How do we design economic systems for human thriving would be how I would put that. And I don't think there's been a lot of work in that. The Web3 stuff theoretically had that as their goal, but in practice it was the complete opposite. Right. Yeah. Another one is religion. The overlap between religion and community is vast, and if you actually look through the literature on that, like how religion works, how community works, how friendship works, there's a lot of overlaps there that are super, super intriguing. And then the last one, which is perhaps, maybe very important for the next 50 years, is governance. Like, how do large groups of people govern one another? And video games are in some ways the perfect petri dish for these type of experiments. Real world governments move very, very slowly. They change very slowly. The ability to try out a new structure of governance is incredibly difficult. But within a video game, you can start up a Minecraft server and add a mod that changes the voting structure of it, really cheaply. And as games move, and I feel that games are going to move more online, more multiplayer, more social, because there's a huge amount of value to deliver there. I think there's opportunities to experiment with governance systems. So those are kind of three big areas that I think video games can have potential in.
I think the religion one is very interesting to me, or that's actually something I've been studying a lot lately. Like, I just finished a great courses on Buddhism and on Hinduism, and like understanding other people's faiths and traditions. And actually a lot of it's going to come through in the game I'm working on now, but in the narrative, there's not going to be any game system about it, but I'm doing something with a very, very heavy dose of social satire. Mm-hmm. And the studying of religion is going to come into play in that one a lot.
I don't know if it's a good book, but it's a super interesting book. There's a uh, anthropologist slash social psychologist called Robin Dunbar. You may have heard of Dunbar's number of like a maximum number of social connections is 150. He wrote a book on religion. So if you look up Robin Dunbar's religion book, he talks about religion from a sort of socialization hardware perspective. Like our brain's ability to make connections between different people and how religion plays into that. It's quite interesting.
So, you're 30 years into a really remarkable career in games. What are some of the goals that you've set for yourself as you look ahead to the next decade? What's the next 10 years of a Daniel Cook game going to look like? Or what are you working on?
Yeah. So there's so I really want I would love for Spry Fox to become sort of a world class uh, cozy game studio. I think there's a lot of space for us to grow there. So can we as a studio become like really good at something that I think there's a lot of people in the cozy space right now. It kind of exploded recently, which is always fun to see. Um, and but I think if we mix that maybe with some of the social multiplayer stuff, I think there's a lot of untapped space where we can like do some new interesting things, not have too many like existing knowledge handed down that we have to follow, and we can still experiment and do wild and crazy stuff while improving ourselves. Um, uh, that's probably like one of the biggest things. Yeah. Um, it's the way I think of I call it a social systems design. We have combat design, we have progression design, we have monetization design. I do think there's a new emerging discipline, which is this social systems design. And I don't think it's been codified yet, but it's fun to be on the cusp of here's another new field essentially within game development. And I'd love to explore that more.
Awesome. And just to close, as I said, this entire interview is pure selfishness, and boy has it delivered, because I have enjoyed every minute of it, and just this is everything I wanted out of talking to you. But here I am. I'm 20 years into game design. I'm a mere journeyman. I'm still working on finding the joy in the chair. And what advice do you have for me when it comes to the next decade of development, of personal development and growth as a game designer?
So the industry is wildly tumultuous. I joke that there isn't a game industry. It's like every 5 years there's a new game industry, which you've lived through a couple of them at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I have noticed something super interesting, which is if you become world class at something, if you become like uniquely good at something, people will sort of like beat a path to your door. And so, like, what are you good at? What do you want to become good at? What do you want to do that, like, uh, lets people say, like, oh, yeah, I need that thing. Oh, I totally know the person. So I think that's one way of doing getting longevity. Um, the like Spry Fox survived as long as it did because we basically had a house style. And we said, do you want a Spry Fox game on your new platform? And if people wanted that, they would say absolutely yes, and then they would pay us money, and we would do a Spry Fox game on their platform. And we were good at that one thing. It's a very specific thing. It's not like monetization or like uh, uh, first person shooters, but like that Spry Fox style was our one unique thing. So I think finding that is really important. And I think one of my goals in the future is to hone in on that more. Um, and that sort of ties into this idea of like you need a unique voice. I think we tend to chase trends a lot. And trends are ephemeral. Web3, it was mostly ephemeral. Free to play, a lot of the Facebook free to play was mostly ephemeral. Mobile free to play has gone through several different types of ephemeral trends. So ultimately, you are a creator and you are an artist. And so, what is your voice, and how does that voice resonate with an audience? And how do you invest in that? Because ultimately, I think that's one of those things that's going to give you an undeniable, unique advantage that lets you keep delivering value for years and years and years to come. Yeah, I don't know. It's a complicated question.
It's a great set of advice, and to tie it back earlier to the that Spry Fox had a style which I would say was a lot about, for a period, it was about vibe, right? It was about art style and vibe and a feeling of coziness, but that wasn't always expressed in the gameplay necessarily.
It's true.
And it was, as you said, when you as a team collectively figured out, oh, we should make the games that align with our preferences and what we're feeling inside of us with our authentic voice, you said everything got easier. Yeah. And so in these challenges you've laid out for me and for the listeners, which is becoming world-class, finding a specialization, I know from several different periods, if you're doing that inauthentically, if you're chasing what you think a trendy voice would be or a popular voice would be, but it's not yours, everything is harder.
Yeah.
Right. And so to tie it back to something from earlier, I feel like one can embark on the journey you've just laid out. First, that you have to figure out what your authentic voice or desires as a creator are, and that's an incredibly hard challenge. And until you figure that out.
It is a journey, is what it is. It's a, know thyself is the worst thing you can possibly say to a person. But that's partially what you have to do here, is you have to go on that journey, figure out what are your intrinsic motivations, figure out what you're good at, figure out what resonates with other people, and do that hard looking inside yourself to and find. To go back to the idea of amplifications, find the things that click, that resonate, and amplify them. Say, oh yeah, this is, like our games are cozy, but they're not saccharine. I don't know if you've played much of Cozy Grove, but it's all about death and ghosts, and it's all about again creating that safe space to process very adult emotions, because people who play that game have lived through all sorts of shit in their life. And they don't need a Disney-fied landscape to tell them to be happy all the time. That's not cozy. Cozy is engaging with the real authentic adult shit that we all go through in a safe space. And so there's darkness in a lot of what we do. And it's been there all along. If you play any of our games, there's darkness in there. But recognizing that as that's a good thing. And we need to put that into our games, because that's the authentic part. Again, you only figure that out by looking at yourself, looking what resonates, and then amplifying it.
Amazing. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. We went real long, and I wish... the pre-interview, our pre-interview document is as good as the interview. And we covered a bunch of stuff in there that we didn't hear that I feel bad that it's just for me at this point and not for the listeners. But thank you so much for coming on and for sharing with us. I really enjoyed this so much.
Very, very enjoyable. Thank you so much.